Gods Will Be Watching is a game I think about a whole lot more than my short amount of time with it would typically merit. It's not entirely successful, but even its failures are really interesting. So, even though I haven't finished it, and probably won't due to these issues, I think it's well worth a closer look. So, what is Gods Will Be Watching? It's kind of like an episodic adventure game, but with a focus on gameplay instead of narrative. Gameplay-wise, it's part point-and-click adventure, part management sim, and part roguelite. It's a little strange, and some elements don't gel quite as well as I'd like, but it's this gameplay that I find so interesting. Because I won't discuss the story any further elsewhere, I will just quickly give an idea of what's going on. You follow Sergeant Burden, who has been tasked with bringing down Xenolifer, and Burden, through time spent within Xenolifer, has begun to develop some sympathy for the cause, and specifically its leader, Liam. Story-wise, it's fairly generic, but not terrible sci-fi that largely only serves to set up individual scenarios. It's in these scenarios that both the episodic and roguelite elements are established. In each scenario, there is a goal and a singular location. If you fail or die, you need to start the whole area over. This setup is one of the great strengths of the game, and as such I'm only going to discuss the first and second area, which acts as a reasonable representation of the game, or at least those bits of it I've played. I'm also doing this because, as I mentioned earlier, I haven't finished this game, and it'd be poor form to discuss elements of game that I haven't personally seen. Before I discuss the gameplay, I want to discuss the visuals. They are absolutely fantastic. Many have grown tired of pixel art and retro stylings, and not without reason. There has been a veritable flood of low-effort takes on the style that give it a bad name. Gods Will Be Watching, though, isn't that sort of game. The care that's been put into the placement of each individual pixel is obvious. The visuals are extremely important in almost any game, but especially so here, given Gods Will Be Watching lacks any voice acting, and generally speaking you're stuck in the one room until you finish that chapter. Cleverly, the visuals largely act as the information you need, so while there are completion meters here and there, much of the information you need to keep track of is rooted in the visuals, especially the animation. In this first chapter, you are taking part in a hostage situation, and need to monitor the mood of these 4 hostages, how close the security team is, and, if you're on top of that, maybe just see how you can speed up the process a little. The main challenge in this stage has to do with the hostages, and measuring their mental state becomes very important. In another game, you might have had a little bar indicating how stressed or confident they were, but in Gods Will Be Watching, you need to figure that out via their animations. It's not difficult to spot individually, the animations for the various states of stress are pretty obvious, but the results are wonderful. You need to actively keep an eye on them the way Burden himself does, and although this doesn't effectively endear you to Burden as a character, it does effectively immerse you in the situation at hand. Unfortunately, sandwiched as it is between the visuals and the gameplay, the UI bears a lot of the frustrations that make it unlikely I will ever finish the game. The most frustrating aspect is how long everything takes to do. First you click on something, choose an option from something like a drop-down menu, and occasionally a further option from there. Taken individually, nothing seems too wrong with this. Aside from text that ends up off screen if you click while the camera is moving, or the mild confusion as to what exactly shoot entails, it's no big deal. But the small amount of time this animation takes begins to add up over the course of one chapter. Remember when I said Gods Will Be Watching is part roguelite? Well, each chapter takes a fair amount of time to finish, even if you're doing everything perfectly, which is incredibly hard to do. The game is designed in such a way that you're rewarded for knowledge of what's to come, which you can only get after failing, and for taking your time making decisions. A few wrong decisions in a row and you're dead. So while this little animation might be nice the first time around, and other aspects like the dialogue might be entertaining at first, after repeat playthroughs, which I remind you are basically essential, they become pretty frustrating. Because Gods Will Be Watching is centered around a point-and-click interface, the gameplay relies heavily on the UI. In order to distinguish the two, I'm going to draw a distinction here that doesn't really apply to most games. When I use the term UI then, assume from here onwards I'm describing the text you interact with, but not the text you don't. If you can click on it, it's part of the UI. If you can't, it's merely a part of the visuals. The gameplay then is rooted in the decisions you make, rather than the mechanics through which you control the game itself, those being of course the UI. If this strikes you as a rather awkward distinction, you'd be right. But there's a lot in Gods Will Be Watching that is awkward to define in the terminology I might typically use, so try to bear with me here. Put more simply, the distinction I make in this specific instance is this. If the UI acts as how you do something in the gameplay consists of what you choose to do. Looking at the gameplay then as a series of choices, you have a surprising amount to discuss. There are a few individual choices that result in an immediate fail state, but mostly there is a progression before you get to that choice. You are allowed to make mistakes, which is great, but you can only make so many before you've screwed up your run. This effectively means that there's a lot riding on every decision. From each decision, there are multiple outcomes as well. For example, shooting at the security team doesn't just force them back, it also stresses out the hostages. Calming down one hostage calms down all the others to varying extents. If you're too soft on the hostages, they'll try to attack you. If you're too hard on them though, they'll run away. And all the while you need to balance out how stressed out they are with the progress you're making in order to eventually make it to the end of the stage. Adding to the weight of each decision is something truly terrifying. Random chance. While as best as I can tell there is an amount of random chance in every scenario, there's none more obvious or more stressful than this one in the second scene of the game. A game of Russian roulette, played a bit over halfway through the chapter, is soul-crushing and terrifying in equal measure. This is true random chance too. It's not just a case of a few safe rounds the first time through, you can easily end up dead on the first shot. This moment embodies precisely all the issues and all the fantastic aspects the game has. It is punishing unlike anything else I've ever come across, to have almost half an hour of gameplay ruined by a roll of the dice, or more accurately, a spin of the revolver. On the one hand, it's unbearably frustrating. It seems entirely unfair. But on the other, it will have you genuinely gritting your teeth each time the trigger is pulled. This unbearable tension the game manages to create is both the reason I think so highly of the game and the reason I don't expect to ever finish it. The core conceit of the game requires it to be so punishing, but it's so punishing as to actively put me off playing any further. Perhaps this apprehension to play the game would have been balanced out by significant reward on completion, but all you get is a small snippet of story, some interesting, although not entirely rewarding, statistics that measure your performance against every other player's, and a few pieces of concept art. But even that perfectly suits the bleak and brutal nature of the game itself. A truly rewarding success might only serve to undercut the relief the game seemingly wants to cultivate at the end of each chapter. Ultimately, it's almost as frustrating a game to discuss as it is to play, because there's something I think is truly brilliant in there, but the game makes it so hard to get there that I'm not sure it's worth trying to do so. The game has plenty of problems, but every issue the game has is conversely the reason it's so interesting, and I don't know whether to recommend or warn against playing it. It's a bizarre game that's at once perfect in its execution and utterly frustrating for that execution. I don't know if this video was satisfying or even useful, but in a sense that seems the perfect way to review a game like this. I can't find any deep or significant answers from the time I spent playing this game, and as a result I can't offer any to you. While I doubt this game will find any new fans from a video like this, I hope it's been interesting to take a look at a game that in every aspect is both perfect and utterly flawed. A minor failure and one of the most fascinating games I've come across. If you've got a different take though, I'd love to hear it. Am I just too weak to finish a game like this? Am I perhaps the issue when the game itself is brilliant? Or is the game a jumbled mess of ideas that just don't work? Let me know in the comments below. Cheers, have a good one.